And welcome back to our panel discussion, FASA Revisited, Precedents in Commercial Item Preference, sponsored by Palantir on Federal News Radio, part of the Federal News Network. And again, our guests are Jeff Kosis, Senior Procurement Executive at the General Services Administration, and Bill Greenwald, Senior Fellow at the Brent Scowcroft Center on International Security at the Atlantic Council. And let's get back to some of the specifics a little bit, Bill, on that Palantir court decision that we talked about at the very top of the show. Again, pretty important precedent, hadn't been tested at the appellate court level at this point. What changes do you see that making, if any, in agency behavior around commercial items?
I hope it would be significant. And this case goes back to the original FASA commercial item preference, and the fact that the courts basically determined that, yeah, Congress meant what it said. It really wanted to move much of its acquisition out to the commercial marketplace. I think that gives the ability for other commercial item providers to protest in the future based on this particular precedent. Now, Congress, essentially, even before this decision took place, tried to strengthen the commercial item preference, at least for the Department of Defense, in frustration with the Department of Defense's inability to move to commercial items. And so in both the 16 and 17 NDAA, there was a reinforcement of the original FASA commercial item preference, and also a requirement for the head of the agency, the head of the Air Force, the Navy, defense agencies, and so on, to essentially determine in writing that when they were out to buy something above the simplified acquisition threshold, whether it's information technology or other type of commercial services that are out on the marketplace, that there is no commercial item out there and available. So that particular provision has yet to be implemented, or those two provisions, both in the 16 and 17 NDA, have not been implemented. But in combination with those, once they are implemented with the Palantir court decision, I think there's a really good chance of trying to break open that market for a number of non-traditional commercial contractors.
I mean, to a couple of your points there, one of the really interesting things to me about the Palantir litigation was that it produced evidence that the Army had actually done quite a bit of market research, which told it that a commercial solution was the correct answer in this case. And then without explaining why, they chose to go in a completely different direction and do a traditional development program.
Well, and when I was up on the Hill, I saw this. You know, this is not just a Palantir issue. This is there's so many examples of these commercial companies trying to break into the market, and for whatever reason, whether it's the culture, whether it's the not invented here syndrome, whether it's the desire to take that last 5% of requirement that may be delivered 15 years from now and continue to wrap an acquisition program around that. I don't know what the ultimate pushback is from the services, but we see that over and over and over again. There's this aversion to taking a commercial off-the-shelf solution and bringing it into the Department of Defense.
And as I said, there was no real documentation of the reasons the Army chose to go the particular route it did, and the court kind of knocked them for that. But there's a tension in that sort of decision-making process, right? Because if you want to go fast, if you want to do things in an agile fashion, you can't spend your life documenting every decision you make and passing paper around to 17 different people. But at the same time, you also do need to kind of be able to show your work and justify the decisions you made if you do end up in a protest, I would think. Jeff, tell me if you have a different perspective on any of that, and just kind of your observations around the general culture around protests that we have at the moment.
Definitely, Jared. Do we need to be able to show our work? Absolutely. The interesting thing about protests, and I think often misunderstood, is a bid protest is never going to come down to, did the government make the right decision? Mm-hmm. It's always going to come down to, did we do what we said we were going to do? So if we say we're going to do something really stupid and we do it, we win the protest. If we say we're going to do something really stupid and we do something brilliant, we lose the protest. Mm-hmm. That's part of the challenge. But maybe to me, the bigger picture in the ongoing discussions of protest reform is this. People tend to count number of protests, say, well, there's only a tiny percentage of procurements which get protested, and thus there's not a problem. The real problem is how much time gets spent not thinking about program execution, not thinking about successful kickoff, not thinking about administration, but thinking and strategizing, how do we win the protest? When that is often the biggest focus of the planning and review meetings, it's a symptom that there is a problem in the protest culture.
It seems to me one thing about buying more commercial goods, moving in an agile fashion, maybe doing smaller procurements, is that you make each individual procurement less high stakes, so there is less of an incentive or a demand on the part of a losing bidder to file a protest in the first place.
Definitely agree with that. Clear benefit of agile, smaller dollar, faster actions, more opportunities. So yeah, totally agree with you.
I want to talk a little bit about more training the workforce on all of these, especially all of these new authorities that Congress has been creating lately. And from a leadership level, Jeff, how do you go about doing that? Again, I don't know how much of this is about giving people information on the specific statutory enablements that Congress has provided, and how much of it is about communicating the message that you were communicating earlier, which is that you do have top cover, we do want you to experiment, we do want you to try new things.
One of the innovations which I stole from Soraya and DHS was the notion of a reverse industry day. This is a training event where industry comes in and talks, presents what the acquisition situation looks like from their point of view, how each government action leads to a decision to compete, not to compete, how the way we frame something feeds back in the pricing, or some of the other impacts. So over the last year or so, we've held 4 different reverse industry days in areas such as cloud, PACS equipment, physical access control systems, leasing, and our schedules program. Each of these, we heard a lot of things about how our business decisions are driving cost in or out of the system. So to me, that was a really good example of how we can use a different approach to training to listen more effectively, and sometimes to buy differently as a result of what we hear.
Ultimately, though, and I've heard great things about reverse industry days, and but ultimately you're going to have to actually bring up to speed a number of new contracting officers and acquisition professionals, and that's going to require money, and that's going to require training budgets. And when I was up on the Hill, we always saw those training budgets be kind of the first to be cut. And so that's one reason why the Hill created the DADF, the Defense Acquisition Workforce Development Fund, which was a way of taking funds that were about to expire and put them in a larger training fund that the acquisition chain could then train its workforce on. So in today's environment, it would be a great thing for using that DADA fund to train in other transactions, to train in the CSO type pilots, to train in how do you do market research for commercial items, and hopefully we'll see that type of a budget allocation from the DADA do that in the Department of Defense.
Bill, since you gave me such a great opening, I'm going to jump right into that one.
Absolutely.
So on the civilian side, the Federal Acquisition Institute is also managed by GSA. So FAI takes care of 170,000 acquisition professionals across all of the civilian agencies, but it does not have an equivalent of the DADA fund, which I believe is around $500 million or so.
It is, yes.
The FAI budget to support the training needs across the civilian side is about $11 million a year.
I want to ask a couple more specific questions about commercial items while we still have some time to take us in some slightly different directions. One of which, the 809 panel, as they've gone through on the defense side, one of the things that their members have described to me is that A big challenge around the whole FAR Part 12 process is that there are so many difficulties and complexities in figuring out whether an item is commercial in the first place or not, and therefore you can apply these simplified procedures, that by the time you get through all that, you've taken as much time and added as much complexity as if you had done a FAR Part 15 acquisition instead. Jeff, let me start with you on this. I mean, is that an issue that civilian agencies, including GSA, face as well, and are there smart ways to simplify that process?
Great. Thank you. And obviously one of the simplest ways is to use FAR 8 and buy these items off of the federal supply schedules.
Teed that right up for you.
Thank you, and I appreciate it.
We were struggling with that, and hopefully the 809 panel will provide a greater clarity to my colleagues still up there on the Hill. But one way we were trying to figure it out is that perhaps we needed to have an entirely definitional change in the sense of that, you're trying to access a non-traditional source of contracting. Mm-hmm. Contractors who do not currently have cost accounting standard systems or Truth in Negotiation Act compliant type of procedures. And so those type of contractors, mostly out in Silicon Valley, Route 128, Austin, wherever, can you just treat what they do as a commercial item? And so, if they're not CAS compliant, therefore they are essentially a non-traditional contractor, and therefore whatever it is they do for the government is done on a commercial item basis.
Another topic I wanted to get to is one of the more recent changes that Congress made, this, and I think this was in the 19 NDAA, where they established in law, I think for the first time, a distinction between commercial products and commercial services. I think up until now it's basically just been everything's a commercial item. And Jeff, I'll start with you on this. I wonder how much that changes the landscape for thinking about commerciality in general.
Short term, we don't see that it makes all that much difference. I think it's more a marker of where we may see future legislation go, what Congress wants to build on that. But, to separate the definition, it doesn't really make a whole lot of difference yet. We'll wrestle with that. In the FAR Council, we'll figure out what we think Congress was intending. But again, a big part of what we try and do on the regulatory front is to give discretion back to the contracting officers. Let them run with it. Bill, but I'd be interested if you have an insight on what Congress was actually after. I know it's from the 809 panel, but what were they after? It
is from the 809 panel. I think, and the 809 panel essentially wanted to simplify all of those get rid of commercial of a type and all, and various types of ways you address commercial items. My view on that is I'm not sure it's going to make that much of a difference, and it may actually slow things down. We've got 25 years of experience with these definitions, and I just don't know how it's actually going to end up being executed. I think that's one of the reasons why Congress said let's delay implementation of this for a little more debate on the idea and see if there's going to be any implementation problems in moving to a new definition.
To that point, as a broader issue, since Congress has made so many pretty monumental changes to the acquisition system in just the last few years, would it maybe be wise to take a breather and let the dust settle a little bit and let people figure out how to use these authorities once they're finally implemented?
Every year when I was up there, we thought that we should take a breather, and every year, for whatever reason, new issues came to the fore. I think it would be this is definitely the time to take a break and start looking at oversight and looking at how these are being implemented and whether or not there are any changes need to be made. I think the 809 panel was the mechanism to allow Congress to take a breather.
It seems that maybe once in a generation we get a really good opportunity for acquisition reform. We last saw that in the mid-90s. We had the two big legislative pieces, and off of that you saw the explosion of the services schedules within GSA. You saw the huge growth of the GSA Smart Pay program. You saw a lot of costs cut out of the system. You saw huge administrative savings and time savings. This last 2 to 3 years, again, we've seen a whole bunch of reform legislation. such as a regulatory rollback, the authority for unpriced service IDIQ vehicles, some of the changes in commercial item definition. These are tremendously valuable opportunities. I don't know how long we're going to have a Congress willing to give us additional authorities to enable acquisition reform, but I want to get as much authority to implement and run with it while I have that opening.
I'd say that is true. There still is that pivot now to the civilian side of the agencies, all those authorities that were given to DOD, and perhaps the government reform committees will start moving on that.
Right, and remember, we share 19 of the same top 20 contractors. We share thousands of contractors overall. We share a workforce. So as much as possible, we want a unified system, a common set of rules, because that is a great way to control costs, to simplify training, to reduce risk throughout the system.
It's been a great discussion, but unfortunately we're going to have to leave it there just because of time. Thank you both for doing this. I really appreciate it. It's been great.
Thanks.
Thank you.
And once again, our guests are Jeff Kosis, Senior Procurement Executive at the General Services Administration, and Bill Greenwald, Senior Fellow at the Brent Scowcroft Center on International Security at the Atlantic Council. I'm your moderator, Jared Serbu, on the panel discussion, FASA Revisited, Precedents in Commercial Item Preference, sponsored by Palantir on Federal News Radio, part of the Federal News Network.
On behalf of WTOP and Federal News Network, thank you for joining us. A link to the archive session will be sent to you shortly. If you requested a training certificate, you will also receive an email with download instructions after the webinar. This concludes our discussion. Thank you.